These are the Moai. They are an important part of Easter Island and the Rapa Nui people. They are the symbol of this island. There are thousands of them.
Scientists have just discovered the truth about Easter Island. The giant stone heads and the Moai. The ones just silently standing there in the middle of the Pacific, looking like ancient guardians of a forgotten world. And what lies beneath, both literally and historically, is so mind-blowing. It's got archaeologists rethinking centuries of history. For decades, we were told one story, that a lost civilization carved these statues, lined them up by the shore, and then vanished. But now, scientists have finally connected the dots. So don't blink, don't click away. And now, finally, we're starting to understand why. The mystery of the Moai statues. The great stone statues of Rapa Nui, those enormous, solemn faces staring silently over the land and sea, have captured imaginations for centuries. People all over the world have seen pictures of them, read about them in books, or watched documentaries that barely scratch the surface of what these monuments truly mean. But how much do we really know about them? And isn't it fascinating that, despite being among the most iconic archaeological images on the planet, the true story behind the Moai, the statue's real name in the Rapa Nui language, is only just starting to be fully understood? To anyone encountering them for the first time, the Moai appear like guardians of some ancient mystery. But to the Rapa Nui people, they were much more than just statues. According to researchers and oral traditions passed down through generations, these monolithic figures were carved between the years 1250 and 1500 CE by the island's early inhabitants, serving not just as art, but as profound symbols of their spiritual and political world. The people believed that these statues housed the spirits of their ancestors, especially powerful chiefs who had passed on. One might wonder, how could stones carry spirits? But for the Rapa Nui, this wasn't superstition, it was sacred truth. The Moai were seen as the living faces of deified ancestors, which in their language is beautifully phrased as Aringa Ora Ata Tapuna. The belief was that once a chief died, their spirit didn't just disappear. It moved into the Moai erected in their honor, continuing to protect the land and the people, watching over agriculture, fertility, and peace. We've all heard about the mysterious statues on Easter Island, but what if we told you scientists have finally cracked the code behind them? Who built them? Why were they placed where they are? And most importantly, what secret have they been hiding for centuries? This new discovery might just rewrite everything we thought we knew. Stick around till the very end, because the biggest twist is something no one saw coming. Now, who carved these remarkable statues? Every Moai was commissioned by a specific clan or family, and teams of expert stoneworkers, under the guidance of a master carver, set out to complete each one with precision and care. These weren't just laborers hacking at rocks. They were artists and engineers, working with incredible skill despite the limited tools available. Without any metal tools, they used only stone implements called toki to shape the statues from compressed volcanic ash known as tuff, which was sourced mostly from the quarry at Rano Raraku. Imagine the level of craftsmanship and patience needed to carve stone that way, day after day, under the sun. It's the kind of dedication that's hard to come by in any era. And while the world often refers to these statues as the Easter Island heads, that's actually a misleading description. Did you know that most of these figures actually have entire bodies? That's right, their heads are indeed large, accounting for about 3/8 of their full height. But they are not just heads. Most Moai are full-bodied figures with torsos, arms, and hands placed neatly along the body. The average statue stands around 13 feet tall and weighs between 10 and 12 metric tons. But some are even more massive. One particularly tall Moai, known as Paro, stands at a towering 33 feet and weighs a staggering 82 tons. And get this, an unfinished statue still lying in the quarry would have reached an incredible 69 feet if completed. Can you imagine the size of that? It's almost hard to wrap your head around how people centuries ago, without modern machinery, could even attempt something like that. Another remarkable detail is the eyes. Some Moai had eyes made of white coral with pupils of red scoria or black obsidian. These eyes weren't just decoration, they were deeply spiritual. The statues were thought to be activated when the eyes were added, and at times, these eyes were removed for certain rituals. Think about that for a second. These weren't just stones to the Rapa Nui, they were spiritual vessels, treated with reverence and care. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came not too long ago. For decades, most people believed the Moai were just heads, mainly because, well, that's what you saw sticking out of the ground. But in 1914, and more thoroughly in recent decades, archaeologists began digging deeper and found that many of these statues have entire torsos buried beneath the soil. So what happened? Why were the bodies buried? It wasn't deliberate. Over hundreds of years, natural erosion, sedimentation, and environmental changes slowly covered the statue's lower halves. This gave rise to the head-only image that many people still hold today. Recent excavations by the Easter Island Statue Project unearthed not only the hidden bodies of several Moai, but also revealed incredible carvings and petroglyphs on their backs, artwork that had been protected underground for centuries. Isn't it mind-blowing to realize how much history we still haven't fully uncovered, even when it's been hiding in plain sight? These statues, carved so long ago, continue to whisper stories from the past to those willing to listen. And even now, with all our technology and research, the full extent of their meaning, their purpose, and the civilization that built them remains somewhat elusive. But one thing is clear. The Moai are not just giant rocks dotting a remote island. They're monuments to a people who held deep beliefs, who honored their ancestors in stone, and who left behind a legacy that continues to stir wonder and curiosity around the world. How the statues were moved. For many years, one of the most puzzling mysteries in archaeology had to do with something quite unusual. How on earth did the people of Easter Island manage to move those gigantic stone statues, known as Moai, all across the island without the help of modern tools? Think about it for a second. No wheels, no cranes, no horses or oxen. Just hundreds of these towering figures, some weighing up to 90 tons, standing tall miles away from the quarry where they were carved. How could a small community of ancient islanders possibly pull that off? The question alone has fascinated researchers and dreamers alike for generations. Now, when scientists first started asking how the Rapa Nui, the indigenous people of Easter Island, moved the Moai, they were met with a flood of theories. Some were grounded in logic, others not so much. People have guessed everything from wooden sleds and rolling logs to divine intervention or even aliens. Yes, aliens. Some early theorists, including authors like Erich von Däniken, were convinced that extraterrestrial beings had a hand in shaping and moving the statues. Why? Because, according to them, the statues were just too perfect, mathematically precise, elegantly symmetrical, and just plain massive. Could ancient humans really have done that on their own? That was the question people kept asking. But as fascinating as the alien angle sounds, there were always those who believed the real story was a lot more grounded. and a lot more human. Among the more realistic ideas, one common explanation was that the Moai were laid flat and dragged on large sleds across wooden rollers. But even that raised more questions than it answered. Wouldn't the island's terrain, hilly, uneven, and filled with rocky ground, make that method nearly impossible? Plus, the Rapa Nui didn't have an endless supply of trees, and many researchers believe that deforestation was already a problem back then. So how could they have moved dozens or even hundreds of statues without destroying their own ecosystem? Some calculations suggested it might take upwards of 150 people just to drag one statue using this method. It was a possible answer, sure, but it wasn't exactly efficient. And then came a shift in thinking, what if, instead of dragging the statues, they actually walked them? At first glance, that might sound like science fiction or a misunderstanding of myth. But in the 1980s, an explorer named Thor Heyerdahl and an engineer named Pavel decided to test this idea. They used ropes and a group of volunteers to rock a smaller statue replica from side to side, almost like shuffling a refrigerator across a floor. To everyone's surprise, it worked. They estimated that a larger team could move a full-sized Moai hundreds of feet in a day using this rocking motion. Still, some experts remained skeptical. Was this really how the Rapa Nui did it, or just a clever modern reenactment? Fast forward to 2012, and the game really changed. Archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo decided to take things further. They created a 5-ton concrete replica of a moai and set out to test the walking theory more rigorously. With just 3 ropes and a team of 18 people, they managed to make the statue move upright across a flat surface by rocking it from side to side. No need for sleds, no logs, no alien technology, just a clever use of balance and rhythm. What was even more interesting was the design of the Moai themselves. The base of the statues was slightly curved, and the bodies leaned forward just a bit. Design features that would actually make walking them not only possible, but likely intentional. Could it be that the ancient sculptors built the statues specifically to be moved this way? Hunt and Lipo certainly thought so, and many in the academic community began to agree. What once seemed like a magical act was now backed by physics and clever engineering. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. For generations, the Rapa Nui people had been telling stories about how the Moai moved, not with ropes or brute force, but with power, supernatural power. In their oral traditions, it was said that the statues walked themselves, aided by mana, a sort of spiritual force or divine energy. Some stories spoke of a chief named Tuku'ihu, who had the ability to command the statues using powers granted by the god Makemake. Other tales credited powerful priests or even a humble cook with the ability to animate the statues through chanting and ritual. The Rapa Nui even had a phrase in their language, neke neke, which means to move without legs. For many years, scholars dismissed these tales as myth, symbolic at best. But now, after these modern experiments, people are beginning to wonder, were the Rapa Nui being literal all along? Could their legends have been rooted in something very real? When you put it all together, the walking theory, the clever design of the statues, the efficiency of the method, and the ancient stories, it becomes clear that this wasn't just a lucky guess or a happy accident. This was engineering. This was cultural knowledge passed down through generations, preserved not in textbooks or blueprints, but in song, story, and ritual. Isn't it amazing how much our ancestors knew, even without the tools we take for granted today? So in the end, what once seemed like an unsolvable mystery has become a powerful example of human creativity and resilience. The Moai didn't fly across the island with alien help. They didn't need to. They walked, moved by ropes, rhythm, and a deep understanding of balance, physics, and spirituality. And perhaps that's the greatest discovery of all, that the people of Easter Island didn't need anyone to come save them from the stars. They already had everything they needed right there on the ground: knowledge, belief, and community. What could be more powerful than that? And that brings us to something truly mind-bending: the way Tiwanaku engineers embedded sacred geometry into Puma Punku, not as decoration, but as a coded message, left behind for those wise enough to see it. Trust me, what you're about to learn will change how you see the ancient world, forever. So stay with us. The truth about Rapa Nui's population. For the longest time, the story of Rapa Nui, better known to many as Easter Island, was told with a heavy sense of doom and despair. People had heard that the island was once bustling with a massive population that grew too quickly, leading to environmental collapse, famine, and ultimately, a community that brought about its own downfall. That tale, repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and even casual conversations, painted the Rapa Nui people as victims of their own excesses. But now? Well, things are changing. Archaeologists, with the help of modern tools and a fresh perspective, are rewriting that narrative completely. Isn't it something how the truth can sit quietly in the dirt for centuries, waiting for the right moment to speak? According to the latest research, what we thought we knew about the island's population, those large numbers like 15,000 or even 30,000 people, might have been major overestimates. New studies, based on more accurate archaeological evidence, suggest that the real number was much smaller, somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 individuals at its peak. And here's the twist. This wasn't a society on the edge of collapse. In fact, they were doing pretty well. The population remained steady and even grew gradually over time, not wildly or unsustainably. The real catastrophe didn't begin until outsiders, Europeans, arrived in 1722. That contact eventually led to devastating Peruvian slave raids and deadly diseases in the 1860s. It wasn't poor planning or overuse of natural resources that brought the population to its knees. It was outside forces. Doesn't that change how we see their story? And speaking of planning, the way the Rapa Nui people managed their land was nothing short of brilliant. Using satellite images and LiDAR scans, researchers have found something astonishing. Almost the entire surface of the island had been carefully and intentionally modified for farming. Yes, even the spaces between the iconic Moai statues, those giant stone heads that have become the island's most recognizable symbols, weren't just ceremonial. They were part of the living, working landscape. You might wonder, how did people grow food on an island that looks mostly rocky and dry today? Well, they had a few tricks up their sleeve. One of the most remarkable techniques was something called lithic mulching. It's a simple idea, really. The islanders scattered volcanic rocks over their fields, which helped trap moisture, protect the soil from erosion, and even added nutrients to the ground. They also built rock gardens, known as manavai, which were circular stone enclosures that served as miniature greenhouses. These structures blocked the wind, held in moisture, and created a better environment for crops. It's kind of amazing when you think about it, how these people living in what looks like a tough environment figured out ways to make the land work for them, not against them. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The soil on Rapa Nui, thanks to its volcanic origin, is actually pretty rich in nutrients. When managed carefully, as the Rapa Nui did, it can support agriculture for generations. The islanders didn't just survive there, they thrived. They didn't ruin their land. They worked with it carefully, lovingly, and it worked. It's worth pausing here to ask, why did the old story, the one about collapse and ruin, stick around for so long? Maybe it was because it made a good cautionary tale. Or perhaps it was easier to believe that people failed due to their own mistakes, rather than acknowledging the harsh truth of colonization, slavery, and disease brought by outsiders. But with this new understanding, the Rapa Nui are no longer just a symbol of ecological disaster. They become something more powerful, a people who adapted, innovated, and succeeded in a place many would find unlivable. So, what should we take away from all of this? Well, perhaps it's time to rethink some of the stories we've been told, especially the ones that blame ancient communities for disasters they didn't cause. The people of Rapa Nui left behind more than just giant statues. They left behind a legacy of resilience, intelligence, and deep environmental awareness. And now, finally, that legacy is getting the recognition it deserves. Isn't it time we listened a little more closely to what the land and the past has been trying to tell us? Not just to the myths, but to the earth, the ruins, and the wisdom that's been whispering through the centuries. Because the real question we should be asking isn't, what did they destroy? But rather, what really caused the decline? Stick around, because the truth might just rewrite everything you thought you knew. What really caused the decline? For many years, people around the world believed a rather grim story about Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it's traditionally called. The popular tale went something like this. The people who lived there long ago had recklessly cut down all their trees, ruined their own environment, and ultimately caused their own downfall. According to this story, they triggered their own collapse through overuse of resources, leading to massive warfare, even cannibalism, and a population crash long before any European ever set foot on the island. It's the kind of story that sounds like a cautionary tale, a dramatic reminder of what happens when humans lose sight of sustainability. But now, thanks to years of modern scientific research, that story is being seriously questioned, if not completely dismantled. And one can't help but ask, how did we get the story so wrong for so long? Fred, a scholar deeply familiar with Rapa Nui's complex past, explained that what was once accepted as fact is now being unraveled by evidence that tells a much more hopeful and, frankly, much more human story. He pointed out that the famous ecocide theory, especially popularized by author Jared Diamond, was built on the idea that the islanders had chopped down all their palm trees to move massive stone statues, Moai, without realizing they were destroying the very ecosystem they depended on. That theory suggested that once the trees were gone, the soil eroded, crops failed, hunger spread, and people turned on each other in chaos. But Fred said recent archaeological findings have shown us something very different. What if, instead of being careless destroyers of their own paradise, the Rapa Nui people were actually resilient, resourceful, and incredibly adaptive? That's the question researchers began to ask as they dug deeper, literally and figuratively, into the island's history. And the answers they found were surprising. Take, for example, the famous obsidian tools called mata'a. For years, these sharp-edged flakes of volcanic glass were thought to be weapons, evidence of violent conflict and tribal wars. But newer studies suggest these weren't weapons at all. Fred mentioned that they were likely used for everyday tasks, gardening, carving, food preparation, or perhaps even rituals. And that changes everything, doesn't it? Suddenly, the image of violent collapse becomes harder to defend. He also emphasized how the actual bones of the islanders told a calmer story. Researchers examined skulls and bones, expecting to find signs of trauma from warfare, broken bones, weapon cuts, injuries that would prove battles had taken place. But surprisingly, only about 2.5% of the skulls studied showed any signs of injury at all. Even more telling, most of those injuries had healed. Doesn't that sound more like a peaceful society than one engulfed in violent collapse? And then there's the cannibalism claim, perhaps the most sensational part of the old theory. Fred shook his head at that one, saying plainly that there's just no solid evidence to back it up, no remains showing clear signs of cannibalistic activity. No bones burned or butchered in the way you'd expect, if people had truly resorted to eating one another. So, where did that story come from? Probably from misunderstandings, exaggerations, and maybe even from the outsiders who first visited the island and didn't quite understand what they were seeing. Isn't it a little troubling how quickly such a dark version of events was accepted without question? Fred believes that what truly happened on Easter Island is something far more meaningful and, in some ways, even more impressive. Instead of collapsing, the people of Rapa Nui adapted. When trees became scarce, they developed new ways to grow food, such as creating rock gardens that helped retain moisture in the dry soil. When European explorers eventually arrived, the island's population was smaller, yes, but that had more to do with diseases, enslavement, and forced relocations than with self-destruction. Doesn't it make more sense that external forces had more to do with the population drop than internal collapse? So why did the ecocide theory last so long in the first place? Fred suspects it's because it was a convenient lesson, a dramatic story that served as a modern parable about the dangers of overconsumption and environmental destruction. It's not that those lessons aren't valuable, but maybe we applied them to the wrong people. Maybe, in our rush to make a point, we ignored the actual evidence and painted the Rapa Nui with an unfair brush. Isn't that a bit ironic, using a fictional collapse to teach others how not to collapse? In the end, Fred said he hopes people will start to see Easter Island not as a warning of failure, but as a powerful story of survival. Impact of European diseases and slave raids. It's easy to think that the downfall of Easter Island, also known as Rapa Nui, was a story of self-destruction, of people recklessly cutting down their own trees and toppling their own culture. That was the theory for a long time. But as modern science digs deeper, a very different and far more heartbreaking truth is emerging. One that shifts the blame away from the islanders and squarely onto the forces of colonization, slavery, and disease. The real disaster, as historians now believe, didn't start with tree cutting or statue building. It began in December 1862, when Peruvian slave raiders landed on the island. Imagine the horror: strangers coming by ship, seizing people by the hundreds, tearing families apart, and dragging them across the sea into forced labor. About 1,400 Rapa Nui, almost half the island's entire population, were taken. Those who survived the brutal journey to Peru faced inhumane conditions that only got worse. Many contracted deadly diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and dysentery. And for what? Sugar plantations? Mines? The survivors were essentially worked to death or died from the illnesses spreading through the camps. Eventually, the world did take notice. Protests erupted in Europe and beyond. Under mounting pressure, Peru was forced to return the few remaining Rapa Nui to their homeland. But that rescue came with a cruel twist. The survivors, unaware and unprotected, brought new diseases back to the island with them. These illnesses, smallpox, tuberculosis, among others, spread rapidly among the Rapa Nui people, who had no natural immunity. It wasn't just a few people who got sick, it was everyone. communities collapsed under the weight of illness and grief. The population plummeted so dramatically that by 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui remained on the island. Let that number sink in. From thousands to just over 100. How does a culture recover from that kind of loss? Yet, for many years, people still clung to the idea that the Rapa Nui destroyed themselves, that they were somehow responsible for their own downfall. They said the islanders deforested their own land, exhausted their resources, and then turned on each other in warfare. It's a narrative that conveniently shifts attention away from colonial guilt. But recent scientific studies are telling a very different and far more accurate story. Thanks to modern genetic research, scientists have examined ancient remains from the island and found compelling evidence. DNA analysis reveals that there was no significant population decline before Europeans arrived. On the contrary, the Rapa Nui population appears to have grown steadily after the island's first settlement, thriving in their isolated ecosystem for centuries. So where did the collapse theory come from? It seems to have stemmed from misinterpretations and perhaps a desire to fit a more dramatic, self-inflicted tragedy narrative. But the science doesn't lie. Further support for this revised history comes from archaeology. Studies of the famous Moai, the massive stone statues that have become synonymous with Easter Island, suggest they were still being built well after Europeans first made contact in 1722. Radiocarbon dating of the platforms the Moai stood on shows construction continued into the 1800s, long past the supposed collapse. If the society had truly fallen apart, who was still building these enormous monuments? Doesn't it make more sense to see this as a community that was still functioning, still creating, even in the face of looming outside threats? So where does all this leave us? What are we supposed to make of this revised story? For one, it forces us to rethink how we talk about history, especially the histories of indigenous peoples. The Rapa Nui didn't collapse because of mismanagement. They were devastated by forces far beyond their control, by foreign diseases, by slavery, and by the ripple effects of colonization. The so-called ecocide theory unfairly blames the victims for their own suffering. Doesn't that sound disturbingly familiar in other chapters of world history? In truth, the people of Rapa Nui were resourceful, organized, and deeply connected to their environment. They maintained a sustainable lifestyle for hundreds of years on one of the most remote islands on Earth. They built a vibrant culture, carved incredible art, and managed their limited resources wisely. The tragic decline came not from within, but from the violent arrival of outsiders. It's not just about setting the historical record straight. It's about honoring the resilience of the Rapa Nui people and recognizing the deep injustices they endured. If anything, this new understanding should invite a greater sense of respect and empathy. After all, how many small, isolated communities could have survived what they went through? So the next time someone repeats that old story about a people who destroyed themselves, maybe it's worth asking, who really brought the destruction? And who's finally telling the truth? With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.